He almost broke the market. He almost bought the presidency's silence. He bought railways instead. He bought a name people whispered, Mephistopheles of Wall Street. And then he turned his fortune into a fortress, a defensive asset meant to protect his family from risk. That fortress became a cage. This is the story of Jay Gould, of rails and gold and a fortune that swelled to roughly $77 million in his lifetime, about $2 billion in today's terms. It is the story of a single daring man who built iron arteries across an expanding country, and of the strange economics that followed when those arteries were handed to heirs who never learned to operate them. It is about a near corner of the U.S. gold market in 1869 that made the nation tremble, and a daughter who sailed to Europe and spent millions on crowns and carriages while the family's tracks rusted. Listen close. There is a paradox at the center of this story. Protecting wealth from risk can strip it of the incentives and capabilities that once produced it. In Jay Gould's case, the wealth that should have been a legacy of businesses became, for his children, a license for consumption. The railroads that created the fortune declined. The fortune itself was insulated from the lessons that might have saved them. He was a railroad man long before he was anything else. Born in 1836 in Roxbury, New York, Gould was restless, hungry for leverage. He moved west as the nation expanded, buying small lines, cutting deals, playing the markets with a dealer's cold precision. He saw rail as more than transportation. Rail was control of land, of commerce, of towns that sprouted along a tie or withered without it. Maps were his scripture. Telegraph lines were his telephone. Boardrooms folded under his tenacity. Picture him in a cramped office, the winter light pressed against a window streaked with coal smoke. On a table lay ribbons of timetables, deeds, mortgage papers. He signed mortgages with a flick of his fountain pen. He brokered leases over the clack of telegraph keys. He built alliances with bankers and politicians. In a single decade, he stitched together an empire of short railroads into longer lines, squeezing profit from consolidation and rate manipulation. There was craftsmanship in his aggression. Then came 1869. Greed and strategy braided into one audacious play. Gould, with partners including Jim Fisk, set out to corner the U.S. gold market. Their aim was to buy so much gold that prices would rise sharply, forcing the government to release its reserves and, with that flow, raise the price still higher. A self-fulfilling squeeze to harvest extraordinary profits. They courted insiders. They used influence. For a moment, the scheme seemed to work. On Friday, September 24, 1869, forever after called Black Friday, the gambit collapsed into panic. Gold prices swung violently. Men who had built fortunes on credit found themselves suddenly insolvent. Markets seized. The New York Stock Exchange halted. Rumors ran through the city like wildfire. Bribery, corruption. The president's name came into the scandal. Brokers in glass-fronted offices watched sunlit tickers tumble. Everyday Americans felt the shock too. Bank runs, collapsing farm prices, tightened credit. Gould walked away with the reputation of a villain. The press called him a speculator without scruple. Congress held hearings, yet his fortune survived. It grew again. By the time he sat at the top of American finance, his estate was worth about $77 million. He had created an empire that in modern terms would rank with the great fortunes of the early 21st century. Enormous, influential, and politically freighted. And then he did what many first-generation magnates do. He fortified that fortune to protect his family. Not with stern lectures or apprenticeships, but with legal instruments, mortgages, trusts, and social arrangements that insulated the heirs from the everyday risks and responsibilities of managing a sprawling industrial concern. In Jay Gould's architecture, family members inherited securities, properties, social status, and comfortable distance from the gritty work of running a railroad. This is where the forensic economics comes in. Look past the headlines and the nicknames and examine the asset class itself. A railroad is not simply an investment you can lock in a vault. It is a living enterprise. Tracks must be maintained, bridges reinforced, locomotives modernized, labor negotiated with, routes defended from competition. Underinvestment, complacent boards, and an absence of institutional knowledge can erode value faster than any market crash. A defensive asset that has been insulated from operational feedback loses the corrective forces that keep it productive. Gould's children inherited a balance sheet, but not always stewardship. Over time, they became known less for stewardship and more for spectacle. They lived in mansions, traveled in private coaches, and spent on jewels and entertainments that signaled a new kind of currency: aristocratic standing. One daughter in particular, Anna, moved to Europe and married into the old world's aristocracy. In 1895, she wed Boniface, known as Boni de Castellane, a Frenchman with a flair for opulence. Their marriage became a headline for gilded excess: balls, chateau remodels, jewels like trophies worn in Paris salons. She later married again, to the Duke of Talleyrand, and spent millions in a life far removed from the depots and freight yards that built the family fortune. These were not hideous parvenus seeking only display. Many of them were sincere in their embrace of art, fashion, and society. But their spending deferred the harder work of preserving and renewing the underlying business. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the railroads that mattered to the family were aging. Technology was changing. Competition intensified. New management philosophies favored consolidation and scale economies, but they also required active, informed governance. Where a founder had once taken every call and ordered a bridge strengthened overnight, heirs insulated by wealth delegated essential decisions or simply accepted declining returns as natural. The defensive asset had become brittle. This arc, from aggressive founder to blissfully insulated heirs, is a pattern we see again and again. The forensic economist's question becomes, at what point does the structure meant to protect wealth begin to undermine the mechanisms that produced it? The answer is not simple. It involves an interplay of legal structure, incentives, social signaling, and human capital. Consider the legal frame. Gould sheltered family assets in ways that limited liquidity and direct engagement. Trusts distribute income but can conceal the principal and discourage risk-taking. They can tax wealth into safe consumption while starved businesses languish. The children received dividends and social capital, not necessarily the boardroom education to manage complex rail systems. Replacing entrepreneurial muscle with passive ownership is an easy default. But when industrial assets require active capital expenditure and strategic repositioning, passive ownership is a slow form of decay. Now consider incentives. When wealth is guaranteed, urgency softens. Heirs might preserve capital in low-risk instruments that pay steady interest but do not keep pace with industrial renewal. Wealth becomes an end rather than a means to a productive enterprise. In the Gould case, the allure of European salons and Fifth Avenue homes competed with the less glamorous necessity of steel rails and timetables. Over decades, the balance sheets might still look impressive on paper, but the operational integrity of the rail system, track quality, rolling stock, freight contracts, degraded. Revenue fell, costs rose. The value of the asset shifted from a dynamic cash flow generator to a static repository for social splendor. This turning point invites another question. Could the family have done otherwise? Could Jay Gould have transmitted both capital and competence? Some families do. Successful multi-generational dynasties often pair legal protection with rigorous apprenticeship, requiring heirs to work in the business, to rotate through departments, to face periodic performance benchmarks. Others institute boards with fiduciary teeth, or they diversify into professional management while keeping a core of family governance active and engaged. What Gould's structure lacked in many cases was that second element, a deliberate transfer of know-how. Pause a moment. Think of Anna in Paris, arranging yet another salon, ordering jewels that cost in the millions, while back in the States, a minor bridge heaved under a winter's load. That image is not rhetorical excess. It is the human face of an economic lesson. Wealth dislocated from its productive core is vulnerable. It does not matter how many carriages you own if the line that supplies your dividend is being skimmed by neglect. We must also reckon with the era's broader shifts. Railroads dominated 19th century transport, but by the early 20th century, new technologies and financial instruments changed the landscape. Automobiles, trucks, better roads, the rise of public regulation, and the consolidation of lines under different corporate strategies all altered the returns to railroad ownership. An heir schooled in the manners of Second Empire Paris would struggle to retool a business to meet these emerging pressures. The economy had moved, the family's skills had not. Inevitably, the narrative tightens toward the human cost. A fortune that felt invincible in Jay Gould's day was susceptible to slow erosion by social choices. The heirs were not villains. Many were merely children of a different culture. They were raised with comforts that obscured urgency. Their expenditures were conspicuous not merely to burnish status, but to fulfill a personal world of art, spouses, and social obligations. Yet those very choices shifted capital away from reinvestment. The railways, left to managers who lacked either the founder's ruthlessness or the heir's devotion, found themselves undercapitalized at critical moments. There are moments of irony here that feel almost cinematic. A man who had almost collapsed a national market in pursuit of profit built an inheritance architecture so protective that it insulated his descendants from the humility of enterprise. They could afford the finest jewels and the most fashionable apartments in Paris. They could not or would not master the nitty-gritty of rail budgets and locomotive procurement. The defensive asset did its job in the narrow sense. It preserved wealth for immediate use. But in the broader sense, the long arc of productive durability, it failed. If this kind of history intrigues you, and you'd like more narratives that mix economics with human drama, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There are many more stories waiting in the seams between money and meaning. After the midpoint, the story deepens. Jay Gould's wealth did not vanish overnight. His descendants were still part of the social and economic elite. Yet their decline was cumulative, subtle, and forensic in nature. Analysts looking back track the erosion in income statements and maintenance records, little signals that, when added up, presaged a drop in the real value of the holding. Bridges left unrepaired, locomotives outdated by a generation, routes ceded to more nimble competitors. These are the invisible lapses that compound faster than headline scandals. We should not romanticize the founder's brutality. Gould's tactics often crossed ethical lines. He was ruthless in a gilded era that rewarded such ruthlessness. That same ruthlessness is what kept assets competitive. It is the engine of reinvention. But reinvention requires a continuous willingness to take risk, to retrench, to sacrifice present consumption for future capacity. One can design legal protections that encourage those behaviors. One can also design them to reward passivity. Gould's choices favored the latter. There is, finally, a moral note that is neither sanctimonious nor sentimental. The story of Jay Gould and his heirs asks us to think about what it means to pass something on. Is a legacy merely a bank account, or is it a set of skills and expectations? Wealth that is simply transferred becomes a test. Will the next generation steward or spend? Will they see capital as a tool for building or as a means to purchase status? For industries that require active maintenance, railroads, factories, farms, the wrong answer leads to decay. For financial assets that compound under professional management, perhaps the need for stewardship is different. But in the case of the Goulds, the sleeping asset was the kind that needed vigilance. Near the end, the personal stakes become visible in the mundane. Heirs who had grown up with private tutors and grand dinners found themselves needing to work for the first time. Some adapted. Many did not. Anna's life in France continued to glitter. Her jewels would outlast the iron ties in the ground, but they were a different ledger. A family that could have been a multi-generational industrial force instead became a constellation of salons and social engagements. What remains today is a lesson and a warning. When architects of fortune build their legacies, they must do more than shield. They must transmit capacity, Law can preserve principle, but law cannot teach judgment. Riches divorced from the work that created them become fragile in new and predictable ways. In the final act, the mood thickens. The railroad ties, once hammered by men in the mud at all hours, once flushed with freight and passengers, quieted. They did not vanish because of one mistake. They regressed because the incentives shifted, slowly, toward consumption and away from renewal. Jay Gould's genius and vice had created a kingdom of iron and credit. His protective instincts had created heirs who lived brilliantly on the margins of that kingdom. The two paths, creation and preservation, diverged. The economy moved on. The family kept its jewels. If you enjoyed this deep dive into capital, family, and the quiet failures of protective strategy, consider liking and subscribing. It helps more than you might think. In the end, the Mephistopheles story is also an American parable. It is about outsized ambition and the cost of insulating success from risk. It is a forensic diagnosis of how a fortune can shelter a family while eroding the very enterprise that made the wealth possible. Wealth can be a defense. It can be armor. But untempered, without the transmission of skill and urgency, it becomes a gilded isolation. Jay Gould built an empire of rails and a fortress of money. Both shaped a future he could scarcely have predicted. Heirs who shone in ballrooms and salons as the rails quietly wore out. Listen to the rails in your mind one last time. Hear the distant click of a train that once hauled grain and coal and people. Hear it fade. That sound is both a loss and an argument, a call to the living to think not just about what we keep, but how we teach others to keep it. Thank you for listening. If you want more stories like this, join the channel and we'll dig into another piece of the hidden economics that shape history.